Welcome to the third episode of Keeping Up with Cleopatra. At the end of episode 2, the ongoing fights between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII and their sister Arsinoe had finally ended because Caesar had stepped in. He defeats Ptolemy XIII and Arsinoe, and in trying to escape, Ptolemy drowns. Arsinoe is captured and sent to exile in Ephesus. Caesar then leaves Cleopatra and their youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, as joint rulers. And then he leaves Egypt for Anatolia to deal with some unrest there. But it was also very good timing for him to remove himself from Egypt because Cleopatra is very pregnant and gives birth to a son. She names him Caesarion and announces to everybody this is Caesar's child. But Caesar has a wife back in Rome who is from a very good family, and he doesn't want to upset the relatives there, so he denies that Caesarion is his child. What we look at in this episode is what happens when he returns to Rome. When Caesar left Rome, he left one of his deputies in his place, and this was Mark Antony. Now, Mark Antony had been a soldier under Caesar for many years, so he should have been a good person to leave as deputy. But he tended to be quite heavy-handed in his response to things, and that made him unpopular. For example, there was a mutiny in southern Italy, so he goes down south to deal with that. While he's doing that, there's some riots starting in Rome. And he comes back to Rome, and his response is to have a lot of the people involved in the riots killed. And this made him really unpopular. A lot of the people who had been supporters of Caesar in the civil war between him and Pompey actually then went and joined up with the other side. When Caesar returns to Rome, he calms everything down and he demotes Mark Antony. We're going to hear a lot about Mark Antony. He was a minor relative of Julius Caesar, a general, a soldier, described as a politician, but I would say not a very good one. And at this point, he was on his third marriage. The first marriage we don't know much about. We only have one mention of it, and it describes him as having several children, but we don't know anything about if they were real, what their names were, what happened to them. His second marriage was to his cousin, and they had a daughter, Antonia. But in 47 BC, he divorces her because she slept with one of his friends, Dolabella, who we will hear about later. So at this point, he's on his third marriage to Fulvia, and they have two sons. Now, he had a lot of affairs, a lot of mistresses throughout all of these marriages, which is quite hypocritical because that's what he divorced Antonia for. But as with Julius Caesar, this was a pretty common event. Now, in the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, even after Pompey's death and his defeat, we still had some of his supporters who are referred to as the Optimates. This consists of two of Pompey's sons, various Roman nobles, soldiers, and they go to Mauritania in northern Africa, and the king of the next door country, King Juba I of Numidia, joins up with them and provides them with support. Now, what happens next is that Julius Caesar takes a group of soldiers and goes to put down the group of the Optimates. And we have a series of battles in northern Africa. He loses the first battle, but he wins the next battle, and it is quite a violent battle, and the defeated soldiers were all killed. At this point in time, it was more common that defeated soldiers were given quarter. So they would be kept prisoner, but they're fed, they're looked after, wounds would be treated. Instead of doing this, Caesar has them all killed. 3 of the leaders commit suicide, and this was something which is quite common for a defeated leader to do at that time. But Pompey's sons and Titus Labienus escape to Spain. Julius Caesar returns to Rome, and he's joined there by Cleopatra and Ptolemy 14 and little Caesarion. Cleopatra can't leave Ptolemy 14 in Egypt because she doesn't want his supporters ganging up and taking control. So she takes him with her when she goes to Rome. They don't stay with Julius Caesar, but they stay in a villa belonging to him very close by to him. And Caesar shows his favour to them in a number of ways. He gives them the status of friend and ally of the Roman people. He has a statue made of Cleopatra. It's bronze with gold, and he displays it at a temple of Venus. Now, this is actually something quite significant because what he is doing is he's linking Cleopatra with the goddess Venus and in the role of the mother of his child. At that temple, there was a statue of the mother of the founders of Rome, and by putting a statue of Cleopatra there, he is making a statement. So he is still not saying that Caesarion is his child. He still has a wife, Calpurnia, but he is making these statements which are increasing the role of Cleopatra in Rome. Now, a lot of Romans were not happy about this because Rome was a republic. They didn't have kings. They didn't have pharaohs, queens, emperors. At this point, it's a republic. So the fact that Caesar was making a big deal about a foreign queen was not seen as being a Roman thing to do. September of that year, Caesar organises something which are described as triumphs. And a triumph is like a festival, a parade that was held to celebrate his victories. Now, at this point, he's had 4 major victories: Gaul, which is now France, Egypt, Phaneces, which is Asia. I probably said that wrong. and the most recent battles in Africa in Juba. And as part of these parades to celebrate how awesome he is, he has defeated leaders of these groups that he has defeated in battle, paraded as in front of the chariots. So the leader of the Gauls was very famous, Vercingetorix. We have him from Gaul. We have Arsinoe from Egypt. And we have the king of Juba the first from Numidia, his son, Juba the second. And they are paraded in front of the chariot. And then at the end of the parade, Vercingetorix is executed by strangling, which is really awful. Ugh. And Julius Caesar is saying to the whole of Rome and the whole of the Roman Republic, what an amazing general he had been. So the four areas, we have Gaul, Numidia, Egypt, and here, Asia. It's described often as Asia Minor. And this is a silver vessel from the time which is showing us a depiction of the triumphs. We have Caesar in his chariot, basically going along as part of a parade. At 45 BC, Caesar travels to Spain and defeats the last of the Optimates because that was where Pompey's sons had run away, fled to after the battles in northern Africa. He defeats them, he comes back to Rome, and he celebrates. But because a lot of the Optimates were either prominent Romans or related to them, celebrating their deaths was not seen as a good thing. This was like celebrating the deaths of their neighbours, friends, relatives, and it was seen as being in very poor taste. Now, a bit of background. In the Roman Republic, they had something called dictators. We have a meaning for that word now. A dictator is somebody who takes control and they're not elected and they basically control everything. In Rome, this was actually an official position, and the dictator did have full control, but it was something where there were limits to it. So, what would happen is if there was a problem, for example, let's say that an area needed to be rebuilt, the dictator was appointed and they had the authority to fix that problem. They had full control, they could do whatever was needed to fix that problem, but only that problem. The Senate still had oversight and held them responsible. And Caesar had been dictator 4 times for various projects, sometimes just 11 days. That was all it took to fix the problem. But from 46 BC, he was appointed annual dictatorships, which were renewed every year. So instead of having a dictator to solve a specific issue, now Caesar is basically a permanent dictator. The Roman Senate should have still had oversight over him as dictator. So the Senate was a very large group The numbers varied, but there were typically several hundred senators. They were all from prominent families, and they basically took care of the management of things. So they interpreted the laws, they controlled spending, they would appoint various people to public office. They could call for the appointment of a dictator, but remember that previously that was for a short time period and the Senate still had an overall responsibility over the dictator. But in 44 BC, Caesar is appointed a permanent dictator. That time restriction is removed, and he's given lots of extra honours and rights. And these are a really big deal. However, there are several things in here which people were not happy about because this is a republic. They don't like kings, they don't like queens, they don't like foreign pharaohs, they don't like emperors, and Caesar was wearing royal dress, sitting on a golden chair in the Senate. That's an awful lot like a throne. Having statues put up in honour of him. So people were concerned that he was starting to set himself up as becoming a king. They also named the 5th month after him. That's why we have July. And a lot of people were getting really worried about the amount of power that Caesar had, the amount of influence, and that he was setting himself up to become a king. And the fact that he had this relationship with a foreign queen was not a good thing, especially Egypt. In Egypt, royalty were like gods. So people were concerned that Caesar was going to become king and then set himself up as being like a god. This is not the Roman way at all. And there were a lot of people saying that Cleopatra had bewitched him. They would talk about her casting a spell over him. In February, there was a festival, and it's to celebrate health and fertility. During the festival, Mark Antony places a crown on Caesar's head. A diadem is a style of crown. Now, Caesar refuses it. He takes it off. He doesn't want to be seen as setting himself up as a king. But Mark Antony has done the damage because people are asking, where does it come from? Are you trying to be king to Cleopatra's queen? Now, was Mark Antony deliberately trying to stir things up? Was he just being his usual put his foot in it self? We don't know. But the damage was done. The common people were also unhappy with Caesar. And a lot of that was about things like debt policies here. Rome worked under a whole series of loans and debts and repayments. And when people were asking for debt relief, he didn't allow it. He decreased the grain dole. So that was basically a ration that was given to the poorest people in the city so they didn't starve to death. And he decreased that. He stopped open elections for various civil positions. He abolished the panel for the poorest jurors in the courts so that then they didn't have a say in anything. And he abolished the College of Clodius, which was made up of a number of groups who would basically go and distribute the grain. And it was like having a number of charity groups who go out and help people. He abolishes this. And so by 45 BC, there's graffiti against him written all around the walls. And we're starting to get a group of people who are saying, we need to do something about this. Now, there are a lot of common people who are not happy, but we also have a group of 60 to 70 who are soldiers, they are nobles, they are members of the Senate, and they're coming from several different backgrounds. Some were supporters of Pompey. They had been against Caesar all along. Others had been supporters of Caesar, but they were concerned he was going to declare himself king, take over. And they're led by a man, Brutus. Now, Brutus had initially been a supporter of Caesar in the battles between Caesar and Pompey. Pompey had been responsible for Brutus's father's death, so Brutus was on Caesar's side. Then Brutus flips and he goes to Pompey's side after Caesar marches his army into Rome. After Pompey's defeated, Brutus goes back to Caesar and Caesar forgives him, and Brutus basically tries to get everybody to work together, Caesar and the former supporters of Pompey. And he's seen as a suitable leader because his family had a history of overthrowing tyrants. At this point, he has flipped several times. We've had Caesar, Pompey, Caesar. Now he's going to betray Caesar. And this happened on the 15th of March, and it's referred to as the Ides of March. The Ides means the midpoint. And this was considered to be an important date, and there's a Senate meeting on that date. Caesar had apparently heard rumours of the conspiracy, but he attends the Senate and he's sitting in his golden chair, and there's an uprising against him. He's attacked and stabbed at least 23 times. There are a lot of jokes about this, this is the first group project, that took 23 people to stab him and bring him down. The significance that he was sitting in his golden chair, was not lost on them, because it was seen as being like a throne. Now, there's a number of stories about his last words. Some of them, he didn't say anything because he was kind of being stabbed by 23 people. He may have spoken Greek, which is described as meaning, you too, child, meaning, you've all betrayed me. In Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, famously he says, A tu, Brute, you too, Brutus. Like, you've betrayed me, you've turned on me. So Julius Caesar, this man who has had all these military successes, this great speaker is gone. What happens? Cleopatra is there in Rome and she tries to have her son recognized as Caesar's heir. But this does not work because Caesar had legally adopted his grandnephew. At this point, we'll refer to him as Octavian. Later, he's known as Augustus. So Caesar had only had one child, Julia, who had died without children. So he adopts his great nephew and makes him his heir. So Octavian inherits the money, estates, and the armies that had supported Caesar. Mark Antony steps in and Rome is all upset, you know. This has never happened before, you know. We have a stabbing in the Senate. Mark Antony seizes control. The leaders of the conspiracy flee Rome. Now, Brutus and also his brother-in-law Cassius, and they flee to the east. Cleopatra takes her son Caesarion and Ptolemy 14 and they go back to Egypt. And within a few months, Ptolemy 14 quietly dies. Now, there are stories that she poisoned him, that he was poisoned with aconite, which is a poison coming from this plant here. That is entirely possible that she quietly removed him. She still doesn't think that Egypt will accept her as a lone ruler. So she has her son Caesarion as her co-ruler, despite the fact he's only 3. So it means that in all effect, she is the only ruler. Because, 3-year-old is not making decisions about the country. So at this point, Cleopatra and Caesarion are back in Egypt. Mark Antony is taking control in Rome, where Octavian has stepped up as Caesar's heir. The sister Arsinoe is still in Ephesus, and Brutus and Cassius have fled Rome for Asia Minor, where they have connections and where the local leaders are giving them support. So Cleopatra has lost her main supporter in Rome. She's lost any chance of having Caesarion recognized as Caesar's child. Rome is in a state of unrest. On the plus side, she's now effectively in charge of Egypt because her brother is dead, her sister is in exile in Ephesus, and her co-ruler is a toddler, so she is the one in charge. However, the whole of the Mediterranean region is in a state of unrest following the events in Rome. And that's what we'll look at in the next episode.